This is the Hoffmann H36 Dimona from Aerosoft, which is a hybrid motorised glider, and if you think it looks a bit like the Diamond Katana, you'd be right. The Katana series was developed from this aircraft. This has been modelled in FSX by the same team that built the Discus gliders, so expectations are high, and it's a great little model. It's a simple aircraft, but it's modelled with a lot of attention to detail. I especially like the way it collects dead flies on the canopy as you fly, but there's a problem with it, I think, which is that you can't control everything in the cockpit without using the mouse. Now, this is not a problem that's unique to this aircraft. It's something we're seeing more and more of as a net consequence of, I think, two different trends in FSX. The first is that ever more sophisticated modelling bypasses built-in functions of FSX to provide a better experience. In this aircraft, for example, the GPS is modelled independently of FSX's built-in GPS, and also the cowl flaps are modelled and operated independently of FSX. This means that in each case these systems don't respond to the standard FSX key mappings, and hence you have to operate them by clicking with the mouse in the virtual cockpit. And this brings us to the second trend, which concerns how the FSX cockpit is modelled and how we interact with it. There are two very different approaches to building an FSX cockpit, and increasingly we're seeing add-on aircraft with sophisticated and often beautifully modelled virtual cockpits. But a virtual cockpit is a compromise that can only approximate the experience of being in an aircraft, and it's very difficult to make it convincingly interactive, even with touch screens, and those in search of greater realism will build an actual cockpit or an approximation thereof and use FSX essentially to display the view out of the window. The problem with that approach is that with more and more add-on aircraft this isn't possible, because there's no way to operate the controls outside of clicking in the virtual cockpit. Now, sometimes this isn't such a big deal, turning the landing lights on and off, let's say, but sometimes it is. Virtual cockpit controls are always a compromise, which is why we all use a joystick or a flight yoke. Nobody in their right mind flies an aircraft by pushing and pulling on a yoke in the virtual cockpit with the mouse, and I would venture that even short of the flight yoke, many virtual cockpit controls are compromised too far. In this aircraft, and with the possible exception of the cowl flaps, we're probably okay. Now, virtual cockpits have really come of age with the introduction of head tracking devices such as TrackIR, but at a price. With TrackIR, clicking a switch in the virtual cockpit becomes even harder still because it's a moving target. Now we have to pause the view to flip a switch, and so on. So compromise upon compromise. That's how it is with FSX. So that's the problem, but what can we do about it? Well, sometimes nothing, but by way of an example, let's have a look at how to get the Dimona's GPS to work without having to touch the mouse. For this we're going to need an add-on called Key to Mouse, and that's by the same guy that's responsible for wide view, and that immediately identifies him as a traditional cockpit builder, but we can still use some of his tricks to our advantage. So Key to Mouse lets us mimic mouse clicks, which we can trigger with keystrokes. Now you probably see where this is going. This is about as dirty a way of manipulating FSX controls as is possible to get, and it's definitely the technique of last resort. But as a last resort, with a little ingenuity, it can really help us do things that would otherwise be impossible. So what we're going to do is bring up the 2D GPS panel, luckily there is one in this case, and essentially to record mouse clicks that operate each button. We can then bind these recorded clicks to keystrokes, and Key to Mouse will effectively play back the recorded click whenever we press the associated key. Now, Key to Mouse knows nothing about FSX, it just blindly plays back the click whenever we tell it to. So if we move the 2D panel, or if we close it, the mouse clicks might click something else, or more often than not, do nothing at all. What this means is we need to decide where we want the panel to be and how big we want it to be before we record any clicks, and that's where we need to leave it whenever we use it. We can still turn it on and off for convenience. And as it happens, Key to Mouse works well with multi-screen setups, so we can move the 2D panel onto its own screen, as long as we do this before recording our mouse clicks. So now we have a much better setup with the GPS on its own screen and controlled entirely from the keyboard. I use a dedicated numeric keypad for the GPS, as you'll see here. In fact, you'll notice that the virtual cockpit GPS follows the 2D one, so we can even turn off the external monitor and fly entirely with the 3D GPS. and it will still be under full keyboard control. So that's just a demonstration of how to hack things around to map unmappable functions to the keyboard. We can also use key to mouse in the virtual cockpit, but this only makes sense if we have a fixed view that we never pan or move around, so definitely no track IR. Most virtual cockpit equipped aircraft have several such views predefined, things like close-ups of the instrument panels for example. And if you have EZCA, you can define your own. One way we might use this in the Dimona is to create a usable scheme for operating the C4 flight computer without the mouse. For this we need 5 buttons, 4 of which simulate the 2 rotary knobs. Unfortunately there's no 2D panel for the C4, but we can define a suitable EZCA view like this one. Now this is really still a work in progress, but just to illustrate how far we can go with this, I'll just quickly show you how to map the rotary controls from a Cytec radio panel to the C4's knobs. Not something we'd probably do, but it illustrates how we could create a scheme to operate this more realistically. And for this I'm using FS-UIPC and also the free SPAD driver for the Cytec panel. So all we need to do is go into the SPAD customization screen and set up the rotary knobs to generate the keystrokes we need. And now we can operate the C4 using just these 2 knobs, as long as we're in the appropriate view in the virtual cockpit. Obviously I've set up prior to this step the key to mouse clicks and key bindings as we did for the GPS. So there it is, key to mouse, a very useful utility for reclaiming the keyboard in an increasingly mousist FSX. As for the Dimona, well, if you can't be bothered with all that, you can just edit panel.cfg and add the standard GPS.